So it seems that our world, and especially technology, are evolving at warp speed. It can feel like that, but all that progress may actually be holding us back. That is the argument New York Times columnist and author Ross Douthat makes in his new book, The Decadent Society, How we became the victims of our own success. And I'm really excited because Ross is here to explain what decadence means for our society, our families, and the future. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Thanks for having me.
All right, so your book explores decadence in 4 categories. Explain to our audience what those 4 categories are and how they relate to each other.
So basically the argument is that since the late 60s and early 70s, and I start with the moon landing because that's sort of a convenient peak to start from that we just had the 50th anniversary of, we've had a kind of slow, gradual economic slowdown where we still have growth, but it's much less impressive than it used to be. We have had technological change, but it's become more and more concentrated just in information technology, communications, and simulation. And so the apps that people are watching us talk to each other on are really impressive, but we don't have the kind of transportation breakthroughs or changes in energy or the built environment that people took for granted. And then we've also had political sclerosis, which basically means that our political system doesn't work very well anymore. There's gridlock and stalemate everywhere you look. And we've gotten older. People have fewer children. Birth rates are below replacement levels all over the Western world, in the Pacific Rim too. And then finally, all the others are sort of provable. The last one is more my sense of things. But there's been a kind of cultural repetition where we're basically rebooting and remaking the same movies that the baby boomers came up with 30 or 40 years ago.
Right.
And so decadence is the recent Star Wars trilogy sort of stomping on the human face forever.
Right. I mean, the idea that as a nation, a state, meaning the state in the historical sense, grows, becomes more powerful, becomes wealthier, that by just default, innovation slows down. The hunger for achievement is not as it was when you're a young, scrappy state in the 17th or 18th century, dealing with colonial empires that are much bigger, that are themselves in the twilight of their decadence.
Yes, and it gets just much harder to reform systems that have been built up over many decades and hundreds of years. So if you look back at just the design of the American welfare state, it's a lot easier to be Woodrow Wilson or Franklin Roosevelt or even Lyndon Johnson and sort of say, we're just going to create this program and that program. It's a lot harder to be Barack Obama or maybe someday President Bernie Sanders and say, well, now we're going to have another revolution, because people are very attached to all the existing programs that you have. But then it also means that it's tough to make those systems work as they get older and interest groups pile up and complexity piles up. And what's interesting is, I've written a book like this just as the coronavirus is kind of doing a stress test on our decadent institutions, and we'll find out if we pass.
It's interesting to me. I was talking to a colleague about this recently, the idea of prior to World War II, if you were a white American here and your father and your grandfather were farmers, you probably were going to be a farmer, right? There was an inflection point in this country where people started to go to college. A lot of people went to college after World War II on the GI Bill. There were programs that were put in place by President Roosevelt and others that enabled the United States to grow in the way that it did. And also, by the way, half of Europe was decimated and nothing was happening there. Right. Times have changed now. People, you could have a grandparent that did not receive a college education but become, a billionaire like Michael Bloomberg, and I wonder then if that means that we're sort of reverting back to the mean as other countries catch up. We're not the only game in town anymore. There are other countries that are able to produce and to produce a society for their citizens that is on par with what we enjoy here in the United States. That it means that we're sort of going back to the way we used to be, and not in a good way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. Basically, America had an incredible amount of what the economist Tyler Cowen calls low-hanging fruit. Basically, you can get incredible dividends for your society just by taking literacy rates from 10% to 90%, making sure everyone gets a high school education, taking college graduation rates from 4% to 34%. But then at a certain point, you start to hit some limits on the gains you can make. Going from a 90% literacy rate to a 95% literacy rate doesn't have the same effects. And America is also a country that, you know, for a long time had a literal frontier, large amounts of space that were sort of available for settlement. Obviously, we took that space from Native Americans. It wasn't just free.
Right.
But it provided sort of a landscape for development that doesn't really exist anymore. And I think people imagined 50 years ago that it might exist in space. That's why people talked about the idea of the new frontier, the idea that, you know, we'd sort of filled the Earth, but now we were going up. And these days, except for Elon Musk, very few people think that way.
That's right. You write in the book that Washington, D.C. is a victim of its own success. What do you mean?
I mean that we have an amazing constitution that's lasted for more than 200 years. We have an incredibly successful government that won world wars, sent people to the moon, did all kinds of things. But it's been around for a long time. And when you have a long-standing institution, it tends to start to creak at a certain point. And as I was saying earlier, people are so attached to existing programs and existing systems that it becomes a lot harder to adapt and change. So if you look at D.C. right now, Congress no longer legislates the way it used to. Power increasingly sort of is traded back and forth between the president, the bureaucracy, and the court, sort of working around Congress. And you have two polarized political parties that are sort of interacting with the existing checks and balances in the system to make sure that almost nothing gets done. So D.C. is basically, for the last, I mean, this has been building, I think, for 50 years, but especially the last 15 or 20 years, it's defined by a sort of mood of hysteria. You turn on cable news and you would think, you know, the world is ending in Washington every day. But really, basically, since Obamacare passed, under both Obama and Trump, almost nothing actually happens legislatively. It's all executive orders and court battles. And
Right.
that's a sign, too, of what I would call political decadence.
You write in the book, both populism and socialism, Trump and Bernie Sanders represent expressions of discontent with decadence. And you were just saying how people tend to be attached to certain things. But if that were, I guess if that were true, the rise of a Bernie Sanders or the rise of a Donald Trump, I sometimes think back, if people were so attached to the way things were, then perhaps they might not have elected a John F. Kennedy after a very sort of milquetoast President Eisenhower, or they might not.
Hey,
not have,
I'll stick up for Eisenhower.
I like Ike. I like Ike, but you know, his presidency represented, perception-wise, something very different than what a young candidate for president in John F. Kennedy represented. Same thing with perhaps Barack Obama or Andrew Jackson, if you want to go back that far, where you find somebody who seems to be cut from a different cloth and who's offering something different. Teddy Roosevelt is another one who offers something different than the norm that people glom onto. So isn't that sort of what we're seeing in folks like Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders?
It is,
away from their politics.
You'll notice that most of the guys you just listed were young. And Bernie and Trump are
That's
both
a great point.
older. And I think that's not a coincidence. Both of them are appealing in different ways, I think, to a sense that America lost its way somewhere. So Trump, obviously, Make America Great Again is literally a slogan that says, we used to be going somewhere great. Remember that. Now we're not. Let's get back to it. But Sanders similarly speaks, I think, to a kind of left-wing view that America took a wrong turn with Ronald Reagan and we can get back to the glorious Scandinavian future. And clearly there is a lot of discontent. But I think and I think they both do represent kind of rebellions against the decadence I'm describing, but they're rebellions that are, I think, very nostalgically focused, and as Trump has done, and I think Sanders would as president, they tend to get enmeshed in sort of the politics of stalemate in D.C. So there is discontent. There are figures who embody it, but they're somewhat backward-looking, and it's hard to know how they would actually succeed in the transformations that they promise, right?
It's such a great point that you make about those younger presidents, or at least who were young when they were elected into office, because I've always found it very strange, not from a politics perspective, but when somebody talks about the good old days, and I'm like, look, you were in the midst of the Great Depression, and you probably lost a family member in World War II, and you escaped Nazi persecution, and you probably caught polio at some level. Here in the United States in 2020, and if you're an African American, you may have possibly been lynched. lynched, or it would have been, and I think to myself, like, the good old days were never good. That's what Billy Joel said. The good old days were not as good as they seem.
Yep.
And 2020 feels much better than it did even when I was born in the 1960s. And so this looking back to something which was never really true is nostalgic. But
But I think it's all about sort of the feeling that people have of a direction and a purpose, right? So I think our society is more stable in many ways than America in the past. It's more prosperous. It's more racially just, certainly. But people look around and feel this sense, I think, of sort of drift and, a lack of optimism about the future and purposelessness, even at sort of these heights of prosperity. And so they look back to earlier eras, not because the 1960s were necessarily better. The 60s were a period of, chaos and violence and tumult in the Vietnam War. They obviously weren't better by some measures, but they were a period of, I think, a greater energy and optimism. And that's what slips away under Decadence. It's not that the Decadent Society is, a terrible place to live. It's obviously not. It's that it's a place that doesn't feel like it knows what's going to come next and doesn't feel like the future is necessarily going to be better than the present.
Ross, I know we're bleeding into our next hour here, but I got to ask you before you go, and I know this is a really important point. I wonder then if some of what you're saying is from the perspective of a white American male who looks back at some of those things and says, gee, wasn't it great? Because somebody who's African American or somebody who's Latino American or Asian American would say, for my great-grandparents, life wasn't that great, and I'm much happier in 2020 with the things that I have now than I would have been in 1920.
So I don't want to end up like white-splaining or anything. So please take this with a large grain of salt. But I think if you look at the African-American experience in this country, the biggest period of achievement and transformation was probably 1940 to 1975. And since then, the black-white wage gap has stayed pretty constant. Black-white test score gaps have stayed pretty constant. So black Americans, obviously, their lives are better now than they were in 1945, but the biggest gains they made were made 30 or 40 years ago. And I think a certain kind of discontent that you see in movements like Black Lives Matter and other places is a response to that, to basically saying, we thought we were making a lot of progress in the civil rights era, and then that, again, in this period of decadence, has stalled out a bit. But again, I am saying that as a white person, so
I did note that.
Take that under advisement. Yes.
Really interesting. The book is called The Decadent Society: How We Became Victims of Our Own Success. Pick it up. It's really fascinating insights into who we are as a society. Thank you so much, Ross, for stopping by.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
I have more of this discussion.